Richard Glossip's case, a new trial and the fight for justice. Imagine being convicted of a crime you swear you didn't commit, sentenced to death, and inching closer to your final day, all while the justice system denies you the fairness you deserve. Now imagine that decades later, the highest court in the land finally declares not only errors, but deliberate wrongdoing in your trial. This is the harrowing reality of Richard Glossip, a man at the center of one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern history. On February 25, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a landmark 5-3 decision, overturned Glossip's 2004 conviction, ordering a new trial. At the heart of their ruling was damning evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, deliberate lies, suppressed evidence, and a system's failure to ensure ethical accountability. For death penalty reform advocates, this was not just a victory for Glossip. It was a clarion call to confront the flaws in capital punishment. This story isn't just about one man. It's about the broader question of justice. Can we afford even one mistake when the stakes are life and death? Richard Glossip, a motel manager, was convicted of orchestrating the murder of his boss, Barry Van Treese, in 1997. But the case against him wasn't built on physical evidence. It rested almost entirely on the testimony of Justin Sneed. Sneed, a handyman who confessed to brutally killing Van Treese, claimed Glossip incited him to commit the crime in exchange for money. In return for his testimony, Sneed received a plea deal that spared him the death penalty. The original trial in 2004 culminated in Glossip being sentenced to death. But from the beginning, doubts arose. Why was there no direct evidence linking Glossip to the crime? Why was Sneed's testimony accepted without deeper scrutiny? For years, these questions haunted activists, legal experts, and reform advocates. Fast forward to February 2025, when justice took a pivotal turn. In Glossip v. Oklahoma, the U.S. Supreme Court revealed critical errors in Glossip's trial. Overturning his conviction, the court cited gross prosecutorial misconduct. At the heart of the ruling was the revelation that prosecutors knowingly permitted Sneed to lie on the stand. This lie, undisclosed to the defense, cast Glossip as the mastermind of the crime. Even more troubling, prosecutors had withheld crucial evidence that could have called Sneed's testimony into doubt and possibly exonerated Glossip. Justice Sonia Sotomayor's words resounded like a gavel across the country. She called the case what it was: a failure of justice. Her opinion wasn't only about Glossip's situation. It was about the responsibility of the system to uphold ethical standards at all costs. The revelations in Glossip's case are a sobering reminder of the system's potential for error. Prosecutors wield immense power, and when that power goes unchecked, lives are jeopardized. Sneed's testimony, secured through a plea bargain, was the cornerstone of Glossip's conviction. Yet the court found that Sneed's statements were inconsistent, unreliable, and incentivized by his deal. The suppression of evidence, too, exposed a deeply rooted issue in capital trials: the failure to disclose material that could exculpate defendants. These were not simple oversights. They were deliberate decisions that stripped Glossip of his right to a fair trial. For years, Richard Glossip's case has been a rallying cry for death penalty reform. Advocacy groups, media outlets, and even lawmakers raised their voices to challenge the legitimacy of his conviction. High-profile figures, including celebrities and former prosecutors, called for reconsideration, citing the fallibility of the justice system. Their message was clear. Richard Glossip's near execution was not just a personal tragedy. It was indicative of a system's inability to balance its own scales. The spotlight on his case grew brighter with every appeal, every denied motion, and every execution date that inched closer. For advocates, Glossip's story symbolized the ultimate question: how many wrongful convictions are buried under silence? Glossip's case is a stark example of what's at stake in death penalty cases. The irreversible nature of capital punishment means that even one error could lead to a catastrophic injustice. In Glossip's situation, the system's flaws brought him to the brink of execution multiple times, despite mounting evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. Death penalty reform advocates argue that errors like these are not rare exceptions, but symptoms of deeper systemic inequities. From coerced testimonies to suppressed evidence, the risks associated with the ultimate punishment are simply too great. Glossip's case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. If the system isn't infallible, can we continue to support a punishment that leaves no room for correction? One of the most damning aspects of Glossip's case was the withholding of evidence that could have changed everything. This evidence called into question Sneed's reliability and motives, exposing glaring contradictions in his statements. By keeping this information hidden, the prosecution built their case against Glossip on a foundation of deception. Imagine being sentenced to death, knowing there's evidence that could save you, but it's buried away. For Glossip, this wasn't just a hypothetical, it was his reality. For reform advocates, it serves as a chilling reminder of how secrecy can lead to injustice. Justin Sneed's testimony remains a focal point of Glossip's conviction. But how reliable is testimony when it comes from someone trying to save themselves? Sneed's plea deal was a lifeline, sparing him from execution in exchange for implicating Glossip. This kind of arrangement raises serious ethical questions. Can testimony given under such stakes ever be fully trusted? Sneed's shifting statements, combined with prosecutorial influence, illustrate a dangerous dependency on incentivized witnesses. Reform advocates argue that cases like Glossip's demonstrate the urgent need for reforms to prevent coerced or incentivized testimonies from overriding facts. Richard Glossip's ordeal is not just a story about one man, it's a glaring indictment of a fractured system. The prosecutorial misconduct, the reliance on shaky testimony, and the withholding of evidence are not isolated incidents. They reflect larger systemic weaknesses that disproportionately affect those facing the death penalty. Why is there such a thin margin for error? Why do these flaws perpetuate in a system meant to represent justice? For reform advocates, Glossip's case underscores the urgency of asking these questions and addressing these flaws head-on. For Glossip, the Supreme Court's ruling represents hope, a chance to fight for his freedom in a retrial. But for death penalty reform advocates, the work is far from over. His story is one of many, a reminder that cases like his may be lurking in the shadows, unheard and unresolved. The ruling invites change, but it alone cannot fix a system built on centuries of inequities. Reform must mean stricter ethical guidelines for prosecutors, greater transparency, and, for many, a re-evaluation of whether the death penalty belongs in modern justice at all. Richard Glossip's case is more than a legal battle. It is a moral reckoning. It challenges us to rethink foundational questions about justice, ethics, and accountability. It forces us to confront our own biases and ask whether the promise of justice can ever be fulfilled when error and misconduct are ingrained within the system. For death penalty reform advocates, Glossip's retrial must serve as a catalyst, pushing toward systemic changes that prevent future injustices. The fight does not end here, it begins anew. As we reflect on Richard Glossip's case, one final question remains. Can justice truly afford mistakes when the stakes are life and death? His story isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a call to action. It's a plea for reform, for accountability, and for the end of a punishment that leaves no room for error. Glossip's fight is far from over, but his story has already left a mark. It has exposed the flaws of a system that failed him, and in doing so, it has ignited a movement determined to ensure no one else faces the same fate. For Richard Glossip, for justice, and for us all, the time to act is now.